They were the picture of a happy, everyday American family, a loving couple, two energetic young boys, and a peaceful home in the California suburbs. No enemies, no secrets, no signs of trouble. But one night, they vanished without a trace. Their dinner untouched, the dogs left behind, the lights still on. For years, the question haunted investigators and stunned the public. How does an entire family simply disappear? The answers would not come easily, and when they finally did, they revealed something far more terrifying than anyone imagined. A discovery in the desert, a trusted friend turned suspect, and a mystery that would expose the darkest corners of betrayal, greed, and cold-blooded murder. This is the chilling case of the McStay family, a story that proves sometimes the real monsters aren't strangers in the dark, but the people we think we know best. The dinner table was carefully set for four. Fresh vegetables had been chopped, and the chicken was left marinating, everything prepared for a calm, cozy evening. Outside, the family dogs barked frantically into the empty California dusk, seemingly at nothing or perhaps something unseen. Inside the house, a movie was paused on the television. A half-full baby sippy cup sat abandoned on the couch. The scent of popcorn lingered faintly in the air. Everything looked lived in. Ordinary, but something was deeply wrong. The Day family was gone. Every single one of them. There were no signs of a break-in. No broken windows, no blood, no struggle. No screams. Just silence. As hours turned into days, and days into weeks, the questions multiplied. Where had they gone? Had they left willingly? Were they in hiding? Or had something terrible happened? Within the walls of that quiet suburban home, years would pass with no answers until, deep in the barren heart of the California desert, miles from any town or witness, a chance encounter would change everything. What investigators uncovered next would tear the case wide open and reveal one of the most haunting mysteries in recent memory. Because behind them Day's seemingly perfect life was something chilling. What really happened inside that house, and how does an entire family, parents and to small children, vanish without a single trace? Joseph Day was not a man who chased fame. He lived quietly, intentionally, a husband, a father, and a creator. By the time he was 40, Joseph had carved out a steady rhythm in life. He wasn't building someone else's dream, he was working. On his own, he had started a business, Earth-inspired products, which specialized in handcrafted decorative fountains. These weren't mass-produced garden items. They were artistic pieces, carefully sculpted stone and water features that turned everyday outdoor spaces into serene sanctuaries. To his customers, Joseph wasn't just selling fountains, he was selling peace, and they loved it. His business was growing steadily. His workshop often rang with the sounds of grinding tools, trickling water, and soft music playing in the background. He had a clear vision, blending nature, function, and beauty. And by his side, always, was his wife, Summer Day. Summer, 43 years old, once known as Virginia Lisa Randa, was a woman of quiet power. To the world, she was simply Summer, a devoted wife, a loving, protective mother. A woman with a sharp eye for detail and a natural instinct for design. She had worked as a real estate agent and occasionally dabbled in interior decorating. She wasn't just involved in the business, she was the soul of the home. Friends described her as gentle, kind, and incredibly thoughtful, but with a protective edge, especially when it came to her kids. At playgrounds or grocery store aisles, Summer never let her guard down. She handled tantrums, strangers, and life's chaos with grace and strength. Together, Joseph and Summer built a life rooted in care, creativity, and routine. They had two sons, Johnny, aged 4, and Joseph Jr. 3. Johnny was curious and adventurous, always asking questions, pulling things apart, and trying to rebuild them using tools he sneakily borrowed from his father's workshop. Joseph Jr. was quieter, a follower, gentle and full of light. He adored his big brother. The two boys were inseparable, their laughter filling every inch of the home. Their house was nestled in Fallbrook, California, a peaceful, eucalyptus-lined neighborhood where people waved from across the street. But didn't pry into each other's lives. Their home was a modest single-story white house with a red tile roof. It wasn't extravagant, but it was filled with love. Them days were the kind of family neighbors nodded to and smiled at. Friendly, stable, unassuming. That's what made their disappearance so terrifying. Everything in the house was just left. The dinner preparations, the paused movie, the baby's cup, nothing taken, no sign of chaos. Just gone. What followed in the desert would only deepen the mystery. What had really been going on behind closed doors? What did investigators find out there, surrounded by sand and silence? And the biggest question of all, how does a family simply vanish? Like smoke, the skies above were wide and open. The Md family wasn't wealthy, but they had enough. More importantly, they had plans, simple, grounded dreams that painted a hopeful future. Neighbors saw them often. Joseph could be spotted in the driveway, loading tools into the back of his truck. Summer was usually nearby, guiding the boys through the cul-de-sac on one of their regular walks. The family's dogs barked cheerfully in the backyard, often chasing squirrels and wagging their tails in the sun. Them days were busy, but in the best way possible. There were projects waiting to be finished, like a backyard garden that had only just been started. But inside their modest home, there was comfort, warmth, and love. The walls were decorated with framed family photos, birthdays, beach days, blurry snapshots of their sons grinning with chocolate-smeared faces. The living room usually had a few toys scattered across the floor, and the air often carried the scent of popcorn or something sweet baking in the oven. Summer had her hands full keeping up with two toddlers, while Joseph balanced phone calls from clients with hammering nails and loading deliveries. Life was hectic, but good, really good. Weekends were. For family time, they'd take the boys to the park or enjoy a casual lunch at a local cafe. Joseph might have one hand on his phone, handling a business call, while Summer kept the kids laughing and entertained. They spoke often about the future, about expanding Earth-inspired products, about finally finishing the backyard, about maybe, just maybe, taking a family trip once the business was on steadier ground. Nothing extravagant, just a few quiet, -1 together somewhere new. They weren't flashy, they didn't make a show of anything. By all appearances, they were a normal family, to parents and to young boys, building a life together with love, patience, and purpose, and maybe. That's what made what happened next so hard to comprehend. There was no sign, no warning, no strange behavior noted by neighbors, no arguments heard through the walls, no reports of threats or tension. Just a family living, working, and dreaming, suddenly gone, behind the routines, the laughter, the pickup and drop-offs. Something no one could see was looming, and within just a few days, the entire family would vanish without a trace. It was February 4th, 2010, a Thursday. Nothing about the day seemed unusual. In the quiet Fallbrook neighborhood, the day house blended into the calm like any other home. The afternoon unfolded normally. Joseph had been working, managing the usual flow of his business. Summer had spent the day at home with the kids. There were no reports of anything odd. No unusual visitors, no raised voices, no red flags. But that day would soon become the beginning of a mystery that would shake everyone who knew them and baffle investigators for years to come. At exactly 7:47 p.m., a neighbor's security camera captured a short, nearly unnoticeable clip. The lower portion of a light-colored SUV, likely the family's Isuzu Trooper, was seen pulling out of the day driveway. No faces were visible. There was nothing in the footage to suggest panic, nothing to raise alarms, but it would be the final confirmed visual of movement from the home. Then, at 8:28 p.m., a call was placed from Joseph Day's cell phone to his business associate, Charles Chase Merritt. The call went to voicemail. Merritt later told authorities that he ignored the message because he was watching a movie and didn't think it was urgent. The phone pinged off a nearby Fallbrook cell tower, its last known location. That call would be the final trace of Joseph Day's phone. After that, everything went silent. In the beginning, no one suspected the worst. Friends and family assumed Them days had taken a spontaneous trip, maybe to explore the area or visit a nearby town. They were a close family, but they weren't the type to announce every move. A few days without contact didn't seem too out of character, but as more time passed, the silence became deafening. It wasn't unusual for Joseph and Summer to be spontaneous, especially when it came to making memories with their boys. They'd occasionally take short, unplanned trips or go quiet for a day or two while enjoying family time, but as the weekend approached, a creeping sense of concern began to take hold. Phone calls to both Joseph and Summer's phones started going straight to voicemail. Text messages were left unread. Emails received no replies. There was no activity on their social media profiles, and no recent transactions had been recorded on their bank cards. It was as if the entire family had simply gone offline. By February 6th, Joseph's father, Patrick, grew increasingly alarmed. He hadn't heard from his son in several days, and that was unlike Joseph. The two were close. Joseph usually checked in regularly. Summer was the same. She kept consistent contact with her own relatives. Now, neither of them was responding. No updates, no explanations. By February 7th, those closest to the family were actively reaching out to one another, sharing their worries, comparing notes, and asking the same questions. Have you seen them? Has anyone heard from Joseph or Summer? One by one, everyone came up empty. Nearly 9 days had passed since the last known contact when, on February 13th, Joseph's younger brother, Michael Day, decided to take action. He drove out to the family's Fallbrook home. The family's Isuzu Trooper SUV was missing from the driveway. The house, from the outside, looked undisturbed. Maybe a little too undisturbed. Michael knocked. No answer. He walked the perimeter, checking windows and doors. There were no broken panes, no signs of forced entry, no lights left on, nothing immediately alarming. But then he reached the backyard and saw something deeply unsettling. The family's two dogs were there, clearly distressed, thin, hungry, and whimpering. It was instantly clear they hadn't been fed or cared for in days. That alone sent a chill down Michael's spine. Joseph and Summer loved their dogs. They would never leave them behind without a plan. Something was very, very wrong. Unable to get inside through the doors, Michael forced his way into the house by climbing through an open window. What he found inside was stranger than anything he had imagined. The house wasn't looted. It wasn't ransacked. There were no signs of a struggle. No broken furniture, no overturned chairs, no glass on the floor, but the home felt frozen, as if time had stopped in mid-motion. In the kitchen, a carton of eggs had been left out on the counter, not forgotten during cleanup, just left there as if someone fully intended to return to them within minutes. In the living room, bowls of popcorn rested on the couch. The TV remote was nearby, suggesting a family movie night had been interrupted suddenly. Children's toys lay scattered across the floor, as they always did, but this time, something about it felt wrong. There were no packed suitcases, no missing clothing, no notes, no messages left behind. The beds were made. A basket of laundry sat half-folded. Mail had piled up on the counter, unopened. It looked as though the family had just stepped out, but they hadn't come back. Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and little Joseph Jr. were nowhere to be found. Every room was checked, the garage, the closets, the backyard, the shed. Nothing. Michael called out their names. No response. The silence wasn't ordinary. It wasn't the peaceful stillness of an empty house. It was the kind of silence that feels wrong, the kind that follows something being cut short, something that should have continued, but didn't. With his heart pounding and dread sinking in, Michael left the house and began making urgent calls to family members and, finally, to law enforcement. Something had happened. He didn't know what, but it was now clear. Them days hadn't gone on vacation. They hadn't left on a whim. Something had interrupted their lives, suddenly, completely, and without warning. On February 15th, Michael officially filed a missing persons report for his brother, sister-in-law, and 10 nephews with the San Diego County Sheriff's Department. Authorities responded quickly. Deputies arrived at the Day residence and began reviewing the same eerie, undisturbed scene. When authorities arrived at the Day residence, their initial walkthrough yielded nothing overtly alarming. There was no blood, no signs of forced entry, no broken windows or damaged locks, nothing obviously out of place. No immediate signs of foul play. Everything appeared normal. To normal. The house felt frozen, a time capsule of daily life. It didn't look abandoned, it looked paused. A family had clearly lived there, laughing, playing, cooking, building their future, and it all looked as if they were planning to return at any moment. The lights still worked. The refrigerator was stocked, dishes sat in the sink waiting to be cleaned. Laundry was still folded on the couch. It didn't look like a family preparing to disappear. It looked like a family that had simply stepped out and never came back. On February 19th, authorities obtained a formal search warrant and conducted a far more detailed investigation. This time, they didn't just look around, they dug deep. Investigators seized the family's computers. They analyzed phone records, they reviewed financial statements. They spoke to neighbors again, trying to construct a clearer timeline of events. They reviewed local surveillance footage, sorted through email threads, and searched for upcoming appointments or calendar entries. Still, the puzzle refused to solve itself. One detail stood out. The family's passports were still inside the home. That discovery all but ruled out the theory of international travel or a planned escape. There were no signs of a sudden move, no recent bank withdrawals, no changes in financial behavior, no travel arrangements, no canceled utilities, no luggage missing, no packed bags. Everything, their home, their bank accounts, their insurance, remained untouched. Investigators found no history of criminal activity, no known enemies, no involvement with drugs or violence. Joseph and Summer were not perfect financially, but they weren't in crisis either. They were hardworking parents, actively involved in their kids' lives, running a growing business and planning for the future. They didn't fit the profile of people running from something, and yet they were gone. So was their vehicle, the family's Isuzu Trooper SUV, but strangely, it had left no trace, no traffic violations, no security camera hits, no license plate scans. It was as if the vehicle and the family inside it had been swallowed by the earth. Neighbors were once again questioned. Had anyone seen unfamiliar vehicles in the neighborhood? Suspicious people raised voices, unusual deliveries, strange visitors. No one had, with no signs of foul play and no clues pointing toward abduction. Some investigators began leaning into a quieter theory. Maybe the family had left on their own, voluntarily. Burnout? A secret relocation? An attempt to start fresh in private? It was a theory, but it didn't feel complete. Then came the first real break in the case. Joseph's Isuzu Trooper was located, not near home, but parked at a shopping center close to the U.S.-Mexico border in Santa Cruz. It had been towed a few days after the family was last seen. Inside, investigators found the children's car seats and various items left behind, clear signs the vehicle hadn't been cleaned or staged for long-term abandonment. If them days were planning to flee, why leave their car? Why not take their belongings? Why wasn't it wiped down? The mystery only deepened, but then another clue emerged. This time from the family's home computer. Investigators found a handful of internet searches made in the days leading up to their disappearance. One stood out immediately. What documents do children need to travel to Mexico? Other searches included Spanish language lessons for kids and traveling to Mexico with children. The implications were hard to ignore. Then, surveillance footage surfaced, grainy and distant, from a border crossing. It showed what appeared to be a family of 4, 2 adults, 2 children, walking into Mexico on foot. The video lacked detail and faces weren't clear enough to confirm identities. But the resemblance to the Day family was enough to spark a storm of speculation. Had they really fled to Mexico? Some investigators believed it was possible the search history, the SUV's location, the border footage. It all seemed to fit, but others weren't convinced. The footage was inconclusive. There were no follow-up sightings. No paper trail, no calls, no digital trace. And for a family so close to loved ones, why would they vanish so completely without a single goodbye? The US-Mexico border near the area where the day's SUV was found wasn't heavily secured. At the time, anyone could cross on foot with relatively minimal oversight, no passports required, no serious checks. Still, despite the lack of definitive proof, the theory that the Day family had voluntarily vanished took hold in both the media and the public's imagination. Headlines ran wild. McStay family escapes to Mexico gone without goodbye. Speculation exploded online. Forums were flooded by amateur sleuths, each with their own theory. Some claimed the family was fleeing financial trouble, others suggested they were running from a threat. A few believed they were starting over, secretly building a new life under assumed identities. Then came one of the most sensational and controversial claims. A self-proclaimed investigator named Rick Baker published a book titled No Goodbyes. In it, he alleged that Summer Day had murdered her family and fled the country. His book painted Summer as unstable, emotionally volatile, and possessive. He accused her of being jealous, manipulative, and unpredictable. He cited vague rumors, secondhand gossip, and flimsy sources, but there was one major problem. Rick Baker had never met Summer. His entire narrative was built on speculation, not fact. And there was no evidence to support his theory. Those who actually knew them days were outraged. Joseph's brother outright rejected the idea that his family had willingly disappeared. Summer's sister was equally firm. Their pushback was grounded in real details, things the public didn't fully understand. For starters, Summer's passport had expired. There were no records indicating new ones had been issued for any family member. So if they did go into Mexico, how were they supposed to come back? Even more telling, the family's bank accounts held over $100,000. There were no large withdrawals, no wire transfers, no evidence they were preparing for an extended trip, or even a short one. The accounts remained untouched after their disappearance. And perhaps most importantly, Joseph and Summer had openly expressed their fear of traveling to Mexico. Drug cartel violence, particularly near the border, had made them deeply uneasy. Friends recalled Joseph saying he had no interest in ever taking his family there. He was especially vocal about avoiding the region. So if they were scared of Mexico, why would they take their two toddlers into that very uncertainty? Slowly, the theory of voluntary disappearance began to collapse under its own weight. Public attention and investigators' suspicions began to shift toward someone else entirely. Charles Chase Merritt. Merritt was the last person to have confirmed contact with Joseph before the disappearance. He was also the last person Joseph had called from his cell phone that night. Official records revealed Merritt had a prior criminal history, including felony convictions for burglary and receiving stolen property. In 2001, he had been convicted of stealing $32,000 worth of equipment from a metalworks company in Monrovia, California. One former acquaintance, interviewed by a San Diego reporter, put it plainly, "I think police should look at him and anyone around him." By 2013, Merritt admitted that he had spent over an hour with Joseph on the day the Day family vanished. He claimed he had taken and passed a polygraph test and insisted he had no involvement in their disappearance. When asked about Merritt's possible involvement, Patrick Day, Joseph's father, struggled with the idea. "I have to have faith in Chase," he said. "Because I have to have faith in my son. I believe Joseph trusted him. Do I think Chase is involved? I don't think so. And I truly hope not." But Merritt's behavior raised questions. At one point, he expressed interest in writing a book about the disappearance, even suggesting Summer had anger issues and that Joseph had been suffering from an unexplained medical condition. Joseph's family confirmed he had indeed been dealing with a mysterious illness and that Summer was especially protective during that time. but they flatly rejected the implication that she had harmed her husband. Patrick Day later said, "I truly believe she loved my son. And then, something happened, a moment that would change everything." The sun hung low over Victorville, California, casting long shadows across the desolate desert floor. It was the kind of quiet morning that didn't hint at anything unusual until one man stumbled upon a nightmare buried beneath the sand. A motorcyclist, taking a shortcut through the wide, barren stretches of the Mojave Desert, slowed near. A patch of low shrubs, something caught his eye, a shape, a disturbance in the ground, something that didn't belong. Curious and uneasy, he pulled to a stop, dismounted his bike, and cautiously approached. What he found would change everything. There, partially exposed in the dirt, lay the unmistakable outline of human remains, bones, bleached by the sun and, half buried in shallow graves. His heart pounded. This wasn't some ancient fossil, this was recent and horrifying. Within hours, authorities had arrived, securing the scene and sealing off the surrounding area for investigation. Crime scene tape flapped in the desert wind as forensic teams combed through the sand. Slowly, the pieces began falling into place. The remains were soon identified as belonging to Joseph and Summer McStay, the couple who had mysteriously vanished. With their two sons 3 years earlier, the discovery sent shockwaves through Southern California. Johnny and Joseph Jr., their 2 little boys, had also disappeared back in February 2010, and for years their case had confounded both investigators and the public. There had been no ransom note, no witnesses, no known threats, just a family that had seemingly vanished into thin air. Now, the most feared possibility had been confirmed. 2 days later, DNA testing conclusively verified the identities of Joseph and Summer McStay. They had not run away. They had not relocated or started a new life. They had been murdered, their bodies discarded like debris in the unforgiving desert heat. The cause of death: blunt force trauma, and what made this discovery even more disturbing was what hadn't been found earlier. Investigators had combed through the family's home back in 2010 and found no signs of a struggle, no broken glass, no blood, no overturned furniture, nothing to suggest a violent end. So how had this family been killed? Possibly in their own home, with no one noticing? Why had their bodies been transported over 100 miles away, only to be buried in the middle of nowhere? The McStay case was no longer a mystery about a missing family. It was now a homicide investigation, one that had remained hidden beneath layers of sand and silence. It was clear this wasn't a random act of violence. It wasn't impulsive, it had been premeditated, planned, executed with chilling precision. Someone had gone to great lengths to erase a family, and nearly succeeded. The discovery in the desert wasn't just the tragic ending to a long unanswered mystery. It was the beginning of a new chapter, one filled with betrayal, darkness, and a desperate search for justice. And just days later, the story would take its most shocking turn yet. On November 5, 2014, the community was rocked when Charles Chase Merritt was arrested by detectives from the San Bernardino County Sheriff's Department. He was charged with the murders of Joseph and Summer McStay, as well as their 2 children, Johnny and Joseph Jr. The McStay family had been missing since early 2010, and Merritt, a longtime business associate of Joseph, had been one of the last people known to have seen or spoken with him. Now, he was the primary suspect in a quadruple homicide. Authorities revealed that Merritt's DNA had been found inside the family's abandoned Isuzu Trooper SUV, discovered years earlier, near the US-Mexico border. It was the break investigators had been waiting for, and the key that unlocked a horrifying theory of greed, betrayal, and calculated murder. The picture they began to paint was one of jealousy, money, and a man willing to eliminate an entire family to cover his tracks. The arrest of Charles Merritt didn't just answer long-standing questions, it raised new ones. Why had Joseph trusted him? What was Merritt hiding? And most terrifying of all, what had really happened inside that house? It all began in 2010, with the sudden disappearance of a family of 4, sparking one of the most baffling and haunting missing persons cases in recent memory. For years, authorities were stumped. The fate of Joseph, Summer, Johnny, and Joseph Jr. McStay remained a mystery, with no answers, no suspects, and no resolution. But in November 2014, everything changed. On the 7th of November, just days after the discovery of the family's remains in the desert, law enforcement made an announcement that sent shockwaves through the community. Charles Chase Merritt, Joseph's longtime business associate and one of the last people to have seen him alive, was arrested and charged with 4 counts of murder. The district attorney's office didn't hold back. They made it clear they would be seeking the death penalty. The arrest was a dark turn in a case that had already shattered the illusion of suburban safety. Now, with Merritt in custody, investigators began unraveling the layers behind his motive. At the center of it all, greed. Merritt's defense moved quickly, filing a request to dismiss the case in July 2015, arguing technical issues in how the charges had been filed. But the court wasn't swayed. The wheels of justice kept turning, slowly but relentlessly. By 2016, the case had already morphed into a legal circus. Merritt fired his attorneys, not once, but repeatedly, eventually going through 5 legal teams before attempting to represent himself in court. His behavior grew increasingly erratic, raising concerns about his mental stability, but the court moved forward. Over time, the evidence against Merritt continued to mount. Autopsy reports on the McStay family revealed horrifying details. All 4 victims, including the 2 small children, had been bludgeoned to death with a blunt object. Forensic analysis later confirmed the murder weapon was likely a 3-pound sledgehammer, discovered buried alongside the remains of Summer and one of her sons. Investigators believed the family had been tortured before they were killed. A revelation that left the courtroom in stunned silence. The brutality of the crime was overwhelming. The victims were defenseless. The violence, deeply personal and merciless. But white prosecutors presented a chilling theory: financial greed. Merritt had a gambling addiction, and in the days following the McStay family's disappearance, he had written checks totaling over $21,000 from Joseph's business account. He then went on a gambling spree, losing thousands at casinos around Southern California. The motive seemed clear. Merritt was drowning in debt, desperate, and willing to destroy an entire family, even children, to cover his tracks. Yet, despite the mounting evidence, the case faced delay after delay. Merritt's constant legal maneuvering dragged the proceedings out, frustrating the victims' families and the wider public. But by January 2019, nearly 9 years after the disappearance, the trial finally began. The prosecution and defense delivered opening statements in a packed San Bernardino courtroom, and the emotional toll was immediate. Relatives of the McStay family prepared to face the man accused of slaughtering their loved ones. Their grief had aged, but it hadn't softened. The pain was still raw. As the trial progressed, family members gave powerful, heart-wrenching statements. They spoke of lives shattered, dreams extinguished, futures lost. Their words weren't just testimony, they were a cry for justice. And, finally, in June 2019, a verdict was reached. Charles Merritt was found guilty on all counts. The jury concluded that the weight of the evidence left no room for doubt. Merritt had murdered the McStay family in cold blood. The jury recommended the death penalty. The verdict brought a wave of complex emotions: relief, sorrow, anger, a measure of justice, yes, but no true healing. Many in the community asked the same question: how could such an evil act go unnoticed for so long? Why hadn't law enforcement connected the dots earlier? How did this monster live among them for years without raising alarm? On January 21, 2020, Merritt was formally sentenced to death. For the McStay family's loved ones, it was the final legal step in a long and painful journey. But closure remained elusive. Merritt was sent to Richard J. Donovan Correctional Facility in San Diego, sentenced to death but protected by California's 2019 moratorium on capital punishment, meaning the sentence would never be carried out. Merritt would spend the rest of his life in prison without parole, but the bigger questions, the moral ones, remained. Was justice truly served? Does the death penalty bring peace, or just extend the cycle of violence? And in cases like This, where trust is betrayed by someone close. How do we ever feel safe again? The mixtape case became more than just a tragedy. It became a symbol. A symbol of how fragile life is, of how trust can be broken in the most devastating way, of how violence leaves scars not just on the bodies of victims, but on the hearts of entire communities. In the end, this wasn't the story of a shadowy killer or a stranger in the night. It was someone they knew, someone they trusted. Charles Merritt wasn't a monster hiding in the dark. He was a familiar face at their table, and maybe that's the most horrifying truth of all. As we reflect on the McStay family story, their kindness, their dreams, their stolen lives, one question echoes: how well do we really know the people we let into our lives? Sometimes the real danger isn't out there. Sometimes it's standing right beside us.